In this video, we'll cover Chapter 28, Progressivism and its Origins. This is Marching for Suffrage, a picture of a New York socialite, Mrs. Herbert Carpenter, who marched for women's rights in 1912. Progressive roots is what we're going to talk about in this video. And the progressive ideas and theories were the old philosophy of a hands-off individualism seemed out of place in the modern machine age, and progressive theorists insisted society could no longer afford the luxuries of limitless let-alone or laissez-faire policies. The people, through government, must substitute mastery for drift. So politicians and writers began to pinpoint targets. Bryan, Altgeld, and populists branded the bloated trusts with a stigma of corruption and wrongdoing. This is a picture of the melting pot in public school number 188 in 1910, showing immigrant children from the Lower East Side of New York. In 1894, Henry Demarest Lloyd criticized the Standard Oil Company in his book called Wealth Against Commonwealth. Thorstein Veblen assailed the new rich in his The Theory of the Leisure Class, 1899, which attacked predatory wealth and conspicuous consumption. In his view, the parasitic leisure class engaged in wasteful business rather than productive industry, and it urged social leadership to pass from superfluous titans to useful engineers. Jacob A. Riis shocked the middle-class Americans in 1890 with his How the Other Half Lives. This was a damning indictment of dirt, disease, vice, and misery in New York slums, and the book deeply influenced Theodore Roosevelt. The novelist Theodore Dreiser used his blunt prose to batter promoters and profiteers in The Financier and The Titan. Socialists registered appreciable strength at the ballot box, and the social gospel movement was created, which promoted a brand of progressivism based on Christianity and used religious doctrine to demand better housing and living conditions for the urban poor. Other reformers were university-based economists who urged new reforms modeled on European examples, and feminists added social justice to suffrage on the list of needed reforms. Urban pioneers entered to fight to improve the lot of families living and working in the festering cities. Raking muck with the muckrakers. Popular magazines like McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's dug deep for dirt that the public loved to read about. The editors financed extensive research. President Theodore Roosevelt called them muckrakers. The reform writers, Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell, targeted corrupt alliances between big business and municipal governments. They wrote exposés of the Standard Oil Company. They wrote about malpractices of life insurance companies, tariff lobbies, and trusts, and some of the most effective fire used by the muckrakers was directed at social evils. This is a picture of a room in a tenement flat, 1910, taken by the camera of Jacob Riis. This is Ida Tarbell in her office, and she was involved in the muckraking movement and one of the most respected business historians of her generation. The immoral white slave traffic in women, rickety slums, appalling number of industrial accidents, and subjugation of blacks and abuse of child labor all became targets of the muckrakers. The vendors of patent medicines also were criticized. Muckrakers signified much about the nature of the progressive reform movement. They were long on lamentation but stopped short of revolutionary remedies. They counted on the publicity to right the social wrongs, and they sought not to overthrow capitalism but to cleanse it. They figured it was the cure for the ills of the American democracy, and that this cure was going to be more democracy. Who were the progressives? They were militarists like Theodore Roosevelt, pacifists like Jane Addams, female settlement workers, labor unionists, and enlightened businessmen. They all sought to modernize American institutions to achieve two goals: to use the state to curb monopoly power and to improve the common person's conditions of life and labor. Jane Addams and her fellow pacifists can be shown here. Addams co-founded the Women's Peace Party in 1915. This is a poster aimed to attract subscribers to the IWW, the Industrial Workers, and the newspaper, Industrial Workers of the World, and the newspaper. Political progressivism emerged in both political parties, in all regions, and at all levels of government. And they sought to regain power from corrupt interests by direct primary elections to undercut party bosses, the initiative, so voters could directly propose legislation, the referendum, which would place laws on the ballot for final approval by the people, and the recall, which would enable voters to remove corrupt officials beholden to lobbyists. Rooting out the graft became a prime goal, and introducing the secret Australian ballot to counteract the boss rule became a weapon in their arsenal. The direct election of senators was a favorite goal achieved by constitutional amendment. The 17th Amendment, approved in 1913, established direct election of U.S. senators. Women's suffrage received growing support, and states like Washington, California, Oregon gradually extended the vote to women. Progressives scored impressive gains in the cities. Galveston, Texas appointed expert-staffed commissions to manage urban affairs. Other communities adopted city manager systems. Urban reformers attacked slumlords and juvenile delinquency and wide-open prostitution, and they all looked to German and English cities for examples of how to improve services, such as cleaning up the water supplies, lighting streets, running trolley cars, and supporting public ownership of utilities. Reforms bubbled up to states like Wisconsin, where Governor Robert Fighting Bob La Follette, a crusader and militant progressive, was a Republican leader. He wrestled considerable control from crooked railroad and lumber corporations and returned it to the people, and perfected a scheme for regulating public industries. Other states marched toward progressivism. They undertook to regulate the railroads and trusts by way of public utility commissions. Leaders such as Hiram W. Johnson of California and Charles Evans Hughes of New York were involved in these movements. Progressive women began to move forward during this time period. Women were an indispensable part of the Progressives' army. The critical focus was the settlement house reform movement, which offered a side door to public life. It exposed middle-class women to problems plaguing the cities, like poverty, political corruption, and intolerable working and living conditions. It gave them skills and confidence to attack those evils. The women's club movement provided a broader civic entryway for middle-class women. Women whose place was seen in the home defended these new activities as an extension, not a rejection of traditional roles, thus driven to moral and maternal issues like child labor, unsafe food, etc. They agitated through groups like the National Consumers League and the Women's Trade Union League, and campaigned for factory reform and for temperance. Florence Kelley became the state of Illinois' first chief factory inspector. She was one of the nation's leading advocates for the improved factory conditions and took control of the new Consumers League. In a landmark case, Muller versus Oregon, Louis Brandeis persuaded the Supreme Court to accept laws protecting women workers by presenting evidence of harmful effects of factory labor on women's weaker bodies. Progressives hailed Brandeis's achievement as a triumph over existing legal doctrines, and in the American welfare state focused more on protecting women and children rather than on granting benefits to everyone. There were setbacks, though. In 1905, the Supreme Court in Lochner versus New York voided the New York law establishing the 10-hour day for bakers. If laws regulating factories were not enforced, they proved worthless. For example, a lethal fire in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company of New York killed 146 women. By 1917, 30 states had workers' compensation laws as a result of that disaster. This is a picture of family members identifying the bodies of victims from the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire at the morgue. Corner saloons attracted the ire of progressives as well, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union mobilized nearly 1 million women. Some states and counties passed dry laws to control, restrict, and abolish alcohol. Big cities were generally wet because immigrants were accustomed to the old country and where they had free flow of alcohol. But by World War I, 1914, nearly half of the United States population lived in a dry territory. Saloon keepers versus homemakers. This Women's Christian Temperance Union flyer tallied the cost of alcohol consumption to a drinking man's family and illustrated the role that women took in the temperance movement. Teddy Roosevelt's square deal for labor. Teddy Roosevelt feared the public interest was being submerged at home. As a progressive, he called for a square deal for capital, labor, and for the public at large. His program embraced the 3 C's: control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. The first test came in the coal mines of Pennsylvania in 1902, where exploited workers struck for better pay and hours. Roosevelt finally threatened to seize the mines if the owners would not agree to arbitration with the workers. This was the first threat to use U.S. troops against owners as opposed to using them against workers. Roosevelt urged Congress to create a new Department of Commerce and Labor, which was created 10 years later and separated into 2. The new agency included a Bureau of Corporations authorized to investigate businesses engaged in interstate commerce, which helped break the stranglehold of monopolies and cleared the road for the era of trust busting. He also corralled the corporations, and first he attacked the railroads by passing the Elkins Act in 1903, which was aimed at railroads' rebates. Heavy fines were imposed on railroads that gave rebates and on shippers that accepted them. The Hepburn Act of 1906 was also passed, which free passes were severely restricted on railroads, and the Interstate Commerce Commission was expanded to include express companies, sleeping car companies, and pipelines. The commission could nullify existing rates and stipulate maximum rates. Trusts were a fighting word in the progressive era, and Roosevelt believed that trusts were here to stay. He believed some were good trusts with public consciences, and some were bad trusts that lusted greedily for power. First burst into the headlines with legal attack on the Northern Securities Company in 1902. The railroad holding company was organized by financial titan J.P. Morgan and empire builder James J. Hill. They sought a virtual monopoly in the Northwest. Teddy Roosevelt challenged them and the potentates of industrial aristocracy. The Supreme Court upheld Roosevelt's antitrust suit and ordered the Northern Securities Company to dissolve. The Northern Securities decision jolted Wall Street and angered big business, but enhanced Roosevelt's reputation as a trust smasher. Teddy Roosevelt initiated over 40 legal proceedings against giant monopolies. The Supreme Court in 1905 declared the beef trust illegal, and the fist of justice fell upon the monopolists controlling sugar, fertilizer, harvesters, and other key products. Roosevelt's real purpose was symbolic, to prove conclusively that government, not private business, ruled the country. This is a political cartoon titled Roosevelt Tames the Trusts. But contrary to popular belief, Roosevelt did not attack all trusts indiscriminately. He pursued a few high-profile cases against a couple of corporate giants in order to tame the businesses into accepting government regulation. Roosevelt believed in regulating, not fragmenting business combines. He hoped to make business leaders more amenable to federal regulation, and he never swung the trust crushing stick with maximum force. The industrial behemoths were more tame by the end of Roosevelt's reign. His successor, William Howard Taft, actually busted more trusts than Teddy Roosevelt did, and Taft launched suits against the U.S. Steel Company in 1911, but it caused a political reaction by Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt also felt that caring for the consumer was important, so he backed a measure in 1906 that benefited both corporations and consumers. Even the meatpacking industry called for safer canned products, following an uproar from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906. It was intended to focus on the plight of workers, but instead it appalled the public with the description of disgustingly unsanitary preparation of the food products, and it described Chicago's slaughterhouses. Roosevelt induced Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act in 1906 as a result, which decreed that preparation of meat shipped over state lines was subject to federal inspection from corral to can. He also passed the Food and Drug Act in 1906, which was designed to prevent adulteration and mislabeling of foods and pharmaceuticals. Minding the meat. White-jacketed inspectors examined the hogs in a Swift and Company packing house in Chicago. Agents like these made some progress in cleaning up America's septic slaughterhouses after the passage of the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. Earth control was next on the list, and they took steps to conserve United States natural resources. The Desert Land Act in 1877 said that the federal government sold arid land cheaply on condition that the purchaser would irrigate the soil within 3 years. The Forest Reserve Act in 1891 authorized the president to set aside public forests as national parks and other reserves. Some 46 million acres were rescued from logging in the 1890s as a result. The Feighery Act in 1894 distributed federal land to states on the condition that it be irrigated and settled. This was a new day for conservation that dawned with Roosevelt, which can be further read about in The Makers of America, the Environmentalists, in your textbook. Roosevelt seized the banner of conservation leadership, and Congress responded with the landmark Newlands Act in 1902, where Washington was authorized to collect money from the sale of public land in the western states and to use the funds for development of irrigation products. The Roosevelt Dam, constructed on Arizona's Salt River, is dedicated by Roosevelt in 1911 as a result. The high point for conservation shows this picture shows Roosevelt and famed naturalist John Muir visiting Glacier Point on the rim of the Yosemite Valley in California. The Pinchos in the Great Outdoors showed Gifford Pinchot, the father of the modern Forest Service, posing with his family of fellow nature lovers. Teddy Roosevelt worked to preserve the nation's shrinking forests, and he set aside some 125 million acres in federal reserves. He also earmarked millions of acres of coal deposits and water resources useful for irrigation and for power. Conservation and reclamation were Roosevelt's most enduring tangible achievements. The disappearance of the frontier, which was believed to be the source of national characteristics of individualism and democracy, encouraged popular support for conservation, as did Jack London's book, The Call of the Wild, written in 1903. This is a picture of loggers in the state of Washington in 1901. Basically, the giant firs were cut down by these men. Once a tree was felled, a team of oxen driven by a bullwhacker would drag the log out of the woods along a skid road. Skid Road, sometimes corrupted as Skid Row, was also the name for the often sleazy sections of logging towns where loggers spent their time in the off-season. Organizations like the Boy Scouts of America became the largest youth group. The Audubon Society tried to save wild native birds, and the Sierra Club in 1892 was dedicated to preserve the wildness of the western landscape. There were also losses during this time period. In 1913, San Francisco built a dam in the Hetchy Valley, which caused a deep division between preservationists like John Muir and conservationists that persist to the present day. This is a picture of flooding the Hetchy Valley to quench San Francisco's thirst. And preservationists like John Muir battled for 7 years to unsuccessfully prevent the building of the dam that would turn this spectacular glacial valley in Yosemite National Park into the Hetchy Reservoir, which provides San Francisco with water. Roosevelt's chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, believed that wilderness was waste. Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt wanted to use the nation's natural endowment intelligently, and so there were 2 battles over it. One with greedy commercial interests that abused nature, and one with romantic preservationists in thrall to simple woodman spare that tree sentimentalities. So the national policy developed multiple use resource management. It tried to combine recreation, sustained yield logging, watershed protection, and summer stock grazing on the same expanses of federal land. Westerners learned how to work with federal management of natural resources, and new agencies such as the Forest Service and the Bureau of Reclamation were created, and they worked with federal programs devoted to rational, large-scale, and long-term uses of natural resources. A single-person enterprises shouldered aside in the interest of efficiency by combining the bulk of big business and big government. This is The Machine and Nature. This was a Harper's Weekly picture which showed sightseers at the Grand Canyon in 1911 and also showed the dawning automobile age. And we'll talk about the Republican Roosevelt, and his second term in our next video.